Should the San Antonio Spurs accelerate their rebuild around Victor Wembanyama? That's what some observers have advocated for, that the Spurs should make a win-now trade in the offseason, perhaps targeting a player like Trae Young to pair alongside Wemby. They've said that the Spurs have wasted Wemby's rookie season with an inadequate roster around him, and that Wemby is already too good right now to waste any more time rebuilding. So let's consider some recent examples of teams that were in a similar situation and what they did and how it turned out for them. Alright, first, let's look at the Dallas Mavericks with Luka Doncic. So Luka came into the league in 2018 as a very highly touted prospect. Maybe not quite to the degree as Wemby, but still, he managed to exceed expectations to start his NBA career. There were similar arguments made at the time about Luka and the Mavericks, that Luka was already too good and that they couldn't waste any more time rebuilding. So, in January of Luka's rookie season, they took a swing, trading 2 first-round picks for a distressed asset, Kristaps Porzingis. Now, in a vacuum, the trade made perfect sense. Porzingis was another young, talented prospect that fit with Luka's playing style and timeline. But what happened? Well, things didn't exactly pan out. Porzingis returned from his ACL injury in Luka's second season, and they made the playoffs 2 years in a row, but got bounced in the first round both times. Porzingis was criticized specifically for his playoff output in 2021, while he was disgruntled with his role. The chemistry between he and Luka never really materialized on or off the court, and he was never fully healthy either, which is one of the reasons he was available in the first place. So the Mavericks ended up moving on from Porzingis just 3 years after acquiring him, having to send him to the Wizards with a second-round pick to simply get Spencer Dinwiddie and Davis Bertans in return. It was essentially a salary dump. So all things considered, the Mavericks' gambit to accelerate their rebuild around Luka by acquiring Porzingis was kind of a waste of time and resources. If anything, the move probably stalled their rebuild or even slowed it down, as opposed to accelerating it. More than likely, they would have been better off just building around Luka internally from the beginning and keeping all those draft picks. Okay, next, let's consider the New Orleans Pelicans with Anthony Davis. So, like Wemby, Davis came into the NBA as a long and gangly but highly touted number 1 overall pick with unlimited defensive potential. And also like Wemby, there were obvious flashes throughout AD's rookie season that he was going to live up to all the hype, if not exceed it. So the Pelicans, understandably excited by their emerging superstar, followed a similar path as the one the Mavericks would eventually take with Luka. They went out and traded for another promising young player, in this case Drew Holiday, coming off of an encouraging 4th season in which he made his first All-Star team. The trade cost the Pelicans a future first-round pick and the player they just took with the 6th overall pick, Nerlens Noel. So, like the Porzingis trade, this, in theory, seemed like a solid move for New Orleans. But what actually happened? Well, like Porzingis, Holiday struggled to stay healthy for his first 2 seasons with the Pelicans. Eventually, though, he and AD would lead New Orleans to the playoffs in their second season together, where they were summarily swept in the first round by the eventual champions, the Golden State Warriors. Then, they disappointingly failed to make the postseason for the next 2 years in a row before finally making it back in 2018. That year, they won their first-round matchup, but then got bounced in the second round in 5 games, again by the eventual champion Warriors. The following season, Anthony Davis, frustrated by the Pelicans' lack of postseason success throughout his first 6.5 seasons with the franchise, informed the team that he would not be signing a contract extension and requested a trade at the trade deadline. The Pelicans, who were understandably determined not to be bullied into a trade, kicked the can down the road, declining to move him at the deadline. But after yet another season without making the playoffs, AD was eventually traded to the Lakers the following summer. So ultimately, was the Drew Holiday trade and accelerated rebuild around AD worthwhile for the Pelicans? Well, it wasn't quite as much of a disaster as the Porzingis move in Dallas, but it didn't amount to much more in the end. Granted, you could argue that AD would have wanted out regardless, but still, trading essentially 2 first-round picks for an all-star to pair with your MVP candidate and winning just 1 playoff series over the next 6 years can't be viewed as much of a success. It wasn't the only reason AD wanted to go to LA, but it probably didn't instill him with much confidence in the franchise, and it's not hard to imagine the Pels having just as much success without having made the move in the first place. So ultimately, we're gonna say the accelerated rebuild and Drew Holiday trade in New Orleans was another failure. Okay, so that's 2 examples of teams that tried to accelerate a rebuild around a rising superstar via trade. But what about some teams that didn't rush their rebuilds and instead showed patience? How about the Denver Nuggets and the Milwaukee Bucks, 2 recent champions that had a surprisingly similar trajectory? Okay, so both teams had an unassuming draft pick, Giannis Antetokounmpo, the 15th pick, and Nikola Jokic, the 41st pick, emerge as noteworthy players early in their careers. But both teams also had other players initially ahead of them in the pecking order, namely Jabari Parker in Milwaukee and Yusuf Nurkic in Denver. But after a few seasons, it became obvious for both franchises that Giannis and Jokic were the stars to build around, with both guys eclipsing 20 points per game for the first time in their 4th seasons. Eventually, both players would go on to win 2 consecutive MVPs in their 6th and 7th seasons. But throughout this time, the Bucks and the Nuggets continued to build patiently around Jokic and Giannis, albeit in different ways. The Nuggets found surplus value in the draft, selecting Jamal Murray with the 7th pick and Michael Porter Jr. with the 14th pick. On the other hand, the Bucks had success with small marginal player acquisitions and internal development. Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez were both essentially picked up off the scrap heap. Eventually, both teams were well established and had a clear identity around their superstar. Only then did they make their big splashy all-in trades. For the Nuggets, it was halfway through Jokic's 6th season when they finally pulled the trigger, trading multiple players and a future first-round pick to Orlando for the versatile wing Aaron Gordon. For the Bucks, it wasn't until Giannis's 8th season when they traded multiple players and first-round picks for the veteran guard Drew Holiday. Both teams reaped the rewards of those trades soon thereafter. The Nuggets won the championship 2 years after acquiring Gordon, which was Jokic's 8th season, and the Bucks won their championship the same season they acquired Holiday, which was also Giannis's 8th season. Now, it's impossible to know in retrospect what would have happened with those teams if they made their big all-in move earlier in their star player's career. But considering the previous examples, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where these teams made their big splashy move too early before they were really in championship contention, using up some of their draft capital and perhaps disenchanting their star player. That kind of ill-timed move can also lead to a negative feedback loop of bad decision-making, in which the team feels pressure to atone for their previous mistakes, so they throw good money after bad and make things even worse. Anyways, what's absolutely irrefutable is that the big moves that the Nuggets and Bucks did make in their star players' 6th and 8th seasons yielded championships. Okay, so that's 2 examples of teams that showed patience before making their big all-in trades. But there's also recent examples of teams that built their championship cores without ever really making a big splashy trade at all. In fact, 2 of the most successful teams of the modern era in the NBA, the Golden State Warriors and the San Antonio Spurs, both stand out as having drafted their big threes. The Warriors picked Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green over a 4-year span from 2009 to 2012. And the Spurs picked Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, and Manu Ginobili over a 5-year span from 97 to 01. Now, granted, it takes a little skill and a lot of luck to draft 3 Hall of Fame players over such a short span of time. But it's probably your best chance of building a dynastic team, especially if you're located in a typical NBA market. Because there have certainly been teams throughout the history of the NBA, and even some in the modern era, who built a dynasty or even just a one-time champion primarily through trades. But usually, those teams are located in a desirable market for NBA free agents, like Miami or Los Angeles. The Milwaukees and the San Antonios of the world aren't typically luring big-name free agents to create the next super team, so they're even more dependent on the draft and internal development. But to go back to the Warriors again, they had an opportunity in 2014, before they won any championships, to trade away a young Klay Thompson and a future first-round pick to the Minnesota Timberwolves for Kevin Love. At the time, Love was one of the hottest commodities in the NBA. He averaged 26 and 12 the season prior. In an article for Grantland in June of that year, Zach Lowe wrote, "Thompson is a really good player, losing him will hurt, but it's not worth losing out on Love. It's not an easy decision, in basketball terms or even emotionally. Sometimes you have to make tough choices to build a title contender." And he wasn't the only one who seemed positive about trading Klay Thompson. In an article for Bleacher Report, Dan Favell wrote, "Trading Klay now will feel wrong on so many levels, but it's still the right move. Unlike Thompson, Love is a superstar. The Warriors cannot pass on acquiring Love when he pushes their needle in ways Thompson doesn't." So yeah, a lot of people thought the Warriors should bite the bullet and make the splashy all-in trade. In the end though, thanks in part to Steve Kerr and Jerry West, they held firm and didn't trade Klay. Instead, they inserted Draymond Green into the starting lineup, and the backcourt of Steph and Klay evolved into arguably the best shooting duo of all time. They went on to win 4 championships over the next 8 years. It was the patient move, not the win-now trade, that ended up being the correct decision in the end. So, to get back to the original question, should the San Antonio Spurs accelerate their rebuild around Victor Wembanyama? Well, as we've been through, there are myriad examples of teams who tried to do just that, a rushed rebuild around a young emerging star and having limited success. Now, you could counter those examples with Magic Johnson or Tim Duncan, young star players who immediately started winning championships upon arrival to the NBA. But those guys both joined franchises that literally had MVPs already on the roster in Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and David Robinson. This current Spurs team that Wemby's on certainly does not include any former MVPs. On the flip side, though, we went through numerous examples of recent teams who either built their championship core entirely through the draft, or who waited patiently until year 6 or 8 of their star player's career before they finally made the splashy all-in trade to finish out their championship core. Waiting to make your move allows you to have a much better sense of the type of player to target in a trade. It gives you the time to assess which players you already have on the roster or will draft over the next couple of years will work with your emerging star player and which ones won't. Being patient also inherently means there will be more trade targets to choose from, as opposed to just settling for the first disgruntled fringe all-star that happens to become available. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, relying more heavily on the draft and internal development builds a sense of chemistry and camaraderie that you need to be a dynastic team. There's a reason why super teams like the Heat with LeBron, Wade, and Bosh, or the Celtics Big Three with Pierce, Garnett, and Allen, rarely last more than 4 or 5 years and sometimes have underwhelming results. It takes time to build chemistry at first, something players and fans often overlook or undervalue. And if none of your star players have any allegiance or loyalty to the team, they're more likely to just leave again when the going gets tough. Now, I don't mean to begrudge players for wanting to move cities or build super teams. Everybody's entitled to work wherever they want and with whomever they want, NBA players included. But again, especially for franchises that are in non-glamorous markets, the history of the NBA would indicate that building slowly and patiently through the draft is really the best way to build a dynasty, or at the very least a championship contending team. It's not always easy or popular to be patient. Skipping steps and making all-in trades is always going to be more fun and interesting and exciting. But oftentimes, the best course of action is the most patient one. After all, going back to the Spurs, their franchise credo is a quote referred to as "Pound the Rock" by Jacob Riis. It's emblazoned on the wall at their practice facility, and it says, "When nothing seems to help, I go and look at a stonecutter hammering away at his rock, perhaps 100 times without as much as a crack showing in it. Yet, at the 101st blow, it will split in two, and I know it was not that blow that did it, but all that had gone before." Many of the NBA's greatest players of all time didn't win championships right away. Michael Jordan didn't win his first ring until his 7th season. LeBron James didn't win his first ring until his 9th season. So going back all the way to the original question, no, the Spurs should not rush out this summer and sign Trae Young to accelerate their rebuild around Victor Wembanyama.